chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. We're actually going to finish the conversation that Boaz has with Ruth. Just a quick review. Act 1, which is in chapter 1, is called Death and Emptiness. It's Naomi's story. She begins the story with a husband and 2 sons. They go to Moab because there's a famine in Israel. The husband dies, Elimelech dies. The 2 boys end up marrying Moabite women. And then 10 years later, both of the boys, the sons, die. So at the end of chapter 1, Naomi is left with one daughter-in-law, Ruth. And Naomi decides she's going back to the land of Israel, and Ruth says, I am going with you. And for the most part, chapter 1 is a very depressing story. The only light at the end of the tunnel is the fact that it's barley harvest season back in Israel, which leads us to Act 2, the search for a short-term security. And in chapter 2, we're introduced to Boaz, a brand new character. And Boaz is a very rich landowner. He's also a man of integrity, and he's going to play a major part in Naomi's story before all is said and done. In Act 2, there are 3 scenes, as there are in each of these acts. The first one is Naomi and Ruth, and they have a conversation in Naomi's house that went something like this. Ruth says to Naomi, we have no food. We have no husband. No one's going to bring us food. I think I'm going to go out and try to glean so that by the end of the day I can bring back some grain so we can eat. And Naomi, who's very depressed at this moment, basically says to Ruth, go ahead. What she doesn't say to Ruth is, well, let me come with you, and at least maybe I'll know one of the landowners. And if I know one of the landowners, then they'll let you glean there because they know me. She doesn't even do that. She just sends out her Moabite daughter-in-law all by herself to find a place to glean and a place to find food. And it just so happens at the end of verse 3 that Ruth ends up in the field belonging to Boaz, which brings us to this second scene, which is between Ruth and Boaz, and also between Boaz and his workers. And this all happens out in a field owned by Boaz, and that's the first encounter between Ruth and Boaz. So we're going to finish that section tonight. Then the next time, we'll look at scene 3, which again, it's Naomi and Ruth back together again. They're back at Naomi's house, and Ruth is going to tell Naomi everything that happened to her that day. And hopefully that will change Naomi's mood, at least we hope. Well, scene 2 is the encounter between Ruth and Boaz, and there's actually 2 conversations between these individuals. The first one is in verses 8 through 13. And it's kind of a back and forth exchange. Boaz speaks, Ruth responds. Boaz speaks a second time, and Ruth responds a second time. The second conversation is in verse 14. And there's a meal time kind of in between the 2. And in the second conversation, only Boaz does the talking. Now, in both occasions, Boaz initiates the conversation. He happens to be one of higher social standing. His speeches are longer. Ruth's responses are short and right to the point. Well, Boaz begins his conversation with Ruth by telling her, I want you to glean in my fields, and you're welcome here anytime, and I want you to follow in behind the female servants, and whatever they drop, whatever they leave behind is fair game for you to pick up, and you can help yourself. And then he says to her, don't go into anybody else's field. Because if you go into another field, I can't protect you and I can't provide for you in that field. So stay in a field that's owned by me. And Ruth hears all this and she asks the question, why are you being so nice to me? Especially since I'm a foreigner. And that's how she defined herself, as a foreign woman. Why are you being nice to me? You know, what's your motivation for being nice to a Moabite woman that you don't even know? I mean, we just met a few minutes ago. Why are you being nice to me? And in verse 11, Boaz will answer her question. And then in verse 12, Boaz will say a prayer for her. Well, in verse 11 is his answer. He says, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know. So Boaz says to Ruth, I've heard your story. And when it says, I've been told, we could translate that, I've been told and told. He's heard it many times over, the story of how Ruth was willing to leave her own father and mother and team up with her mother-in-law. I mean, who does that? And not only that, she leaves her country where she has friends, where she knows people. And she comes to a brand new country that she knows very little about. She sacrificed everything in order to help Naomi. Now, this introduces a principle that was very common, very prominent in the Old Testament. It's a principle that still exists for the most part today, and it's called the law of reciprocity. And the law of reciprocity basically is you're going to reap what you sow. And Boaz says to Ruth, you have done a huge favor for Naomi. So I'm going to return the favor by doing a huge favor for you. So the law of reciprocity is if you do good, good will come to you. And if you do evil, evil will come to you. And the people in the Old Testament saw that as a major law of how the world works. Where did they get this idea? Well, they got it from the covenant that the people of Israel had with God under Moses. And we read about that covenant in the book of Exodus and also in the book of Deuteronomy. And it's a really simple covenant, although it's a conditional covenant. It's an if-then covenant. And it's really easy to understand. If you do good and follow God's laws and worship only Him, God will bless you. But if you break God's laws, if you worship other gods, then God's going to punish you and use the other nations around you to bring judgment upon you. So it's an easy thing. If you do good, you'll get blessed. If you do bad, you're going to get punished. I mean, a 3-year-old can understand that. The only problem with the Israelites was they couldn't keep it. In the Old Testament, there's 635 laws, and they were supposed to keep them. If we just talk about the top 10, what we know as the 10 Commandments, the Israelites could not get past commandment number 1. Commandment number 1 is, you shall have no other gods except me. Where God says, you worship me, you don't worship Baal, you don't worship Moloch, you don't worship any of the female goddesses. You only worship me. Simple enough. But when you read the Old Testament, time and time again, the Israelites are worshiping the gods and goddesses. They've forsaken the God of heaven. They're breaking commandment number 1, and eventually God punishes them. He brings judgment upon them. So that's where they got this simple idea. You do good, you get blessed. You do bad, you get punished. The law of reciprocity. And many times in life, it works out that way. In fact, Boaz wants it to work out that way for Ruth. You've done all these nice things for Naomi. People ought to do nice things for you. In fact, Boaz says, I'm going to be first. Let me be the first to do something nice for you because you've done something nice for Naomi. The problem is that principle doesn't always work. I mean, what if you do good and you get evil in return? And what if you look around and there are people doing bad things and everything good is going for them? It's the problem when the righteous people suffer and the wicked people prosper. And in fact, there are several books in the Old Testament that cry out against that? The book of Job. I mean, Job was a righteous man, and he practically loses everything. There are several psalms called lament psalms, asking God, what's going on? You know, it seems as though you're making your people suffer, and those people who want nothing to do with you, they seem to be prospering. How can you let that happen? That's not how it's supposed to go. Because according to this law that we understand, if we do well, you're supposed to be blessing us, and if we don't do well, you're supposed to be punishing us. So if we're doing well, we should be blessed, and those people who want nothing to do with you, you should be punishing them. But it doesn't always work out that way. In fact, the book of Ecclesiastes says, vanity of vanity, all is vanity, all is empty, because I can't figure this out, says Solomon. I look at the world, and this law is not working out for me. Now, to a certain extent, that law continues today. Because, if we're living for God and doing everything, we know that God wants us to do, we would expect his blessings. But what if it just so happens that we're doing everything we can to serve God, and we're just barely scraping by? I mean, we're just barely have enough money to pay our bills. But that person across the street who never goes to church, who uses God's name as a cuss word, that guy's got so much money he doesn't know what to do with it. What's wrong with this picture? And that's often what the ancient people had to deal with, and we deal with it too. Now, of course, in the New Testament, we have a little more understanding. We understand that there's a kingdom coming, and it's the kingdom of Christ. And it's going to be a 1,000-year kingdom that goes on into eternity. And in that kingdom, that's when the righteous will be blessed, and that's where the wicked won't even be invited to participate. So we understand that there is an ultimate judgment coming, but often in this life, we don't see that. And so Boaz believes in this law of reciprocity, and he thinks good things should happen to Ruth because she's been so good to Naomi. And then he says a prayer for her in verse 12. And I love the first line of this prayer. It says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done." And what he means by that is, you've done great things for Naomi. May the Lord pay you back. But if we look at that statement, not in context, but just as a statement, we kind of shudder. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. And we're thinking, no. I've done some bad things. I've committed some sins, as in more than one. I really don't want the Lord to repay me for what I have done. Instead, I want God's grace. I want God's mercy. I want God's forgiveness. I want his favor. So this is a good Old Testament verse, but not a good New Testament verse. Because in the New Testament, we don't rely on the law of reciprocity. We rely upon the grace and mercy and forgiveness of God. But in context, this makes perfect sense. What Boaz is praying for Ruth is that God would reward her because she's been good to Naomi. Then he goes on to say, may you be richly, completely rewarded by the Lord. So, again, that's part of what Boaz believes, that God's going to reward those who do good things. And it's interesting that Boaz is thinking, yeah, God needs to reward Ruth, and it looks like I'm going to be the one that God uses to make that happen. And so he's very kind to Ruth, very generous to her. In fact, we're going to look at some more things tonight that he does for her. Because of her loyal service, God should pay her back by rewarding her with good things. Boaz also recognizes that when Ruth came to Israel, Ruth did not come to Israel for the purpose of causing all the Israelites to give up the God of heaven and worship Moabite gods. So in other words, she didn't come here to convert Israel into the worship of the Moabite deities. She came here because she's attached to Naomi and also Naomi's people and also Naomi's God. So Ruth is willing to learn about the true God of heaven and worship him. So not only did she give up the land of Moab, she gave up the gods and goddesses that she used to worship in Moab as well. So Boaz realizes this, and so he says, "The God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." It's an interesting metaphor for God. It's a bird protecting the chicks under her wings. And Boaz says, as this bird would protect her chicks, may God protect you. May God bless you. And it's through Boaz that God is going to protect Ruth and also provide for Ruth as well. So, and these are just one of those metaphors that we use for God. That doesn't mean that God's a big bird and has wings. It doesn't mean that. It's just a metaphor to help us understand God's protection and God's provision. Then in verse 13, Ruth's going to respond again. And she's going to want that favor. She's going to pray that that favor continues to come her way. And she's also going to be very grateful for what Boaz has done. So she says, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes." The word favor, in many ways, is the key word in chapter 2. Before Ruth goes out to glean, she says to Naomi, "I'm going to go out and glean. And whoever's field, I can find favor." She's looking for favor. She's looking for grace. She also says to Boaz, after he says to her, "You can glean in my field at any time," she goes, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes?" And now she says in verse 13, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes." She went out looking for favor, and she found it in a big way because of Boaz. So this whole idea of finding favor means that you have been gracious to me, you have been kind to me. The idea of favor is the idea of grace, mercy, loving kindness being expressed to her. Ruth is a very polite individual, so she calls Boaz "my lord." And that was a term of respect. Obviously, he's the landowner and she's a gleaner, so she calls him "my lord." And now it's interesting that she calls herself "your servant." Back in verse 10, she called herself a foreigner. Now she calls herself "your servant," even though I'm not one of your servants. I mean, technically, I'm not one of your servants, but in essence, you're my Lord and I'm your servant. Now, actually, being a maidservant, a servant, would be a step up for Ruth. Because in Israelite culture, if you were a servant, you got the bottom rung of the ladder. You were on the bottom and had to work your way up. But at least you were on the ladder. If you're a foreigner, you're not even on the ladder. You don't even count. You have no place in Israelite society. So as we look at Ruth's self-esteem, because Boaz is being so kind to her, maybe her self-esteem is stepped up, maybe just a little bit. She no longer calls herself a foreigner, she calls herself a servant. She goes on to talk about how Boaz's kindness and favor has impacted her. And the first thing she says is, "You have put me at ease. You've made me comfortable." Can you imagine a Moabite woman just recently moving to the land of Israel? She looks around where she's living with Naomi and there's no food. And Naomi's old, so she's got to do something. And so she decides she's going to go glean in a field. She knows absolutely no one. And the rumor around town is she's a Moabite. She's a foreigner. And she showed up with Naomi. And so she has to go out to these fields hoping that somebody will let her glean. Now, according to Israelite law, she was supposed to be allowed to glean. But if you read the book of Judges, who was following Israelite law in the book of Judges? Hardly nobody. So there's a good possibility she would be rejected. She could be harmed. She could be killed. She could be made fun of. She could be humiliated. All kinds of horrible things could have happened to her. But she had to do something. She had no food. So she takes this huge chance and just so happens to show up in the field of Boaz. And he's kind to her. And so she says, you put me at ease. You've made me comfortable. Now, Ruth, when she ventures into the field, she's a destitute, unattached, foreign woman. Now, in the ancient world, you can't get any lower than a destitute, unattached, foreign woman. She's destitute, meaning she has no money and she has no food. She's unattached. She has no husband. She has no one to take care of her. Her father's back in Moab. She's a foreigner. She's a Moabite living among the Israelites. And she's a woman. It doesn't get any lower than that. A destitute, unattached, foreign woman. And she's just hoping that somebody will show her a little favor. And Boaz comes along and offers her two things: protection and provision. As long as you're in my field, I'll make sure you're protected. As long as you're in my field, I'll make sure you have food. Wow. Incredible. And then she goes on to say, by speaking kindly to your servant. Speaking kindly literally is speaking to the heart. It speaks of compassion and sympathy. He understands where she's coming from. He kind of puts himself in her shoes and goes, wow, somebody ought to do something nice for this woman. I mean, she's taken this huge chance of coming to our country, coming to help her mother-in-law. Somebody ought to do something nice for her. And Boaz decides, I will be the one to do that. And so after this, there's kind of a break because the next scene is at mealtime. So that conversation ends. And apparently Ruth goes back to gleaning. And then their second conversation will be in verse 14. And in this second conversation, Boaz will speak, and there's no response by Ruth. This mealtime is the midday meal. And you can imagine back in the ancient world when it comes to harvesting, you begin at sunup, so you can see. You quit at sundown because you can't see any longer. So after working since sunup, I'm sure people are tired, they're hungry and thirsty, and it's time for a meal. And it's an interesting scene in verse 14 because Boaz is going to eat with his workers. And his workers are basically his servants. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And during this meal, Boaz is going to show favor to Ruth in 5 different ways. So he's not done showing favor to her. It's mealtime, and let's notice what he does. And the first thing is Boaz says to her, come over here. He invites her to have the meal with himself and with his servants. So she gets to join in a meal with Boaz and everyone who's a servant of Boaz. All the workers, all the harvesters. And it's interesting that Boaz says to her, come over here. Now, there may have been some kind of signal that it's time to eat. And so all the harvesters go into probably a tent that's set up, a shelter that's set up in order to have their meal. And Ruth's thinking, it's not for me. I'm not a servant. I don't work for Boaz. So I'm just going to step over here and step out of the way because I don't belong with the rest of them. But Boaz says to her, oh, Ruth, come over here. So he invites her to have a meal with himself and the workers. It's remarkable. He just invited a Moabite outsider to have a meal with them. Now, we have to understand a little bit about ancient families. It was quite common in the ancient world that people who were rich would have servants. And the servants were actually considered part of your family. They're part of your extended family. So as a male, you'd have a wife, you would have children, you'd have your sons and your daughters, and then you would have your servants. And they were part of your extended family. In the New Testament, in the book of Ephesians, Paul talks to Christians about their home. He talks to husbands and wives first. Then he talks to parents and children. And then he talks to masters and servants. And scholars have called this the household code or the household regulations. How to have a Christian household. Because back in the ancient world, you had a marriage, you had parents and children, and you often had servants as well. So they were part of your family. So as Boaz sits down for this meal with his male and female servants, it's like a family meal. And into this family meal, he says to Ruth, come over here and have a meal with us. And she does. She accepts the invitation. It says she sat down with the harvesters. She's not a harvester. She's a gleaner. But she gets included with the harvesters, meaning she's now part of the group. And I'm kind of reading between the lines, but Boaz seems to be a very smart man, and he knows that Ruth has a very low self-esteem. And it came from that first conversation when she called herself a foreigner. He's trying to build her self-esteem in the ancient world. And including her with the harvesters, with the servants, would help build her self-esteem. You're not a foreigner. You're part of my group. Because back in the ancient world, it mattered what group you belonged to. And Ruth is being treated like one of the harvesters, not like a foreigner. So this was quite remarkable that this would happen. Now, Boaz knows Ruth has left her father and mother. She's left her country. She left that. And now Boaz is saying, okay, you left all of that. Come join my family. Come have a meal with my family. You don't have to feel like an outsider anymore. You left your family. I'll include you in my family. What an incredible thing he did for her. And the second thing he says to her is, have some bread. Now, this bread was brought in, probably by some servants. It was for the workers. It wasn't for the gleaners. Which raises the question, did Ruth bring her own lunch? Did she bring her own food? And chances are the answer is no. Because chances are she didn't have anything to bring. And not only that, but that conversation with Naomi kind of leads to the conclusion that they needed food desperately. Also, just to jump ahead, Boaz is going to give Ruth so much food, she can't eat it all. So what does she do with the leftovers? She gets a to-go box and takes it home to Naomi. Why? Chances are Naomi's been home all day with no food. And Ruth is going to bring some food home to her. So Boaz is saying, eat the bread that my family eats. you're invited to do that. And then he says to her, dip it in the wine vinegar. Well, the wine vinegar was probably some kind of sauce or condiment that we would dip bread into. Bread has a tendency to be dry. Also, there's not much taste to it. So by dipping it, it would become moist, and also it would add some flavor. It would spice it up. So that often happens in a restaurant. You get the little oil and vinegar. You take the bread, you dip it. It's pretty good. So apparently they were doing something like that back in the ancient world to make the bread taste even better. And the whole idea is, Ruth gets to share in the good bread, not just the dry bread. She gets to dip it in the sauce too, because she's part of the group. And then he goes on to say that he offered her some roasted grain. And that's the fourth thing he does for her. You could eat the grain fresh, or you could roast it in the fire. Obviously, roasting it in the fire would make it taste a little bit better. It was a common food in ancient Israel and also in the ancient Near East. So Ruth doesn't have to eat scraps like a beggar, because that's probably what she would have done. She's gleaned some already, and she would have probably just eaten some of the scraps. No, she gets the roasted grain along with the rest of us. So, and also he offers it to her. In essence, he serves her. Now, Boaz didn't serve the rest of the servants, but apparently he served it to Ruth. Including her in the group. She's like a special guest, and she's being offered the roasted grain. And then finally, she ate all she wanted and had some left over. He provided for her in abundance. In the ancient world, having an abundance didn't happen all the time. It's not like today where you go to the grocery store and you can buy food for a week, a month, or 2 months. You could just store it all up in your freezer, refrigerator, and pantry. They didn't do that back in the ancient world. If you had enough food to eat today where you were satisfied, that was a good day. And to have abundance, to have leftovers, that didn't happen often. In fact, when Jesus feeds the 5,000 with the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they make a point that they didn't let anything go to waste. The disciples went around and ended up with 12 baskets of leftovers. So Jesus provided not just for their needs, he provided leftovers, which in the ancient world was a huge blessing. And Boaz does the same for Ruth. She not only has enough food for that meal, she has leftovers. And we find out in verse 28, she takes the leftovers home and gives them to Naomi. So he provides everything she could possibly want. It's interesting that there's a word in the Hebrew, it's called hesed. It's often translated loving kindness. It's one of those words that are hard to define because there's so much wrapped up in it. Hesed is love, mercy, grace, loyalty, faithfulness, all wrapped up into one. And Boaz is showing hesed to Ruth. It's interesting when Jesus shows up as Messiah, and he sits down for a meal, and he invites the tax collectors and sinners to come eat with him. It would be kind of like a rich landowner inviting a Moabite woman to come have a meal with him. It's like, what are you doing? We don't do that. We don't invite foreigners to have meals with us. And the Pharisees complaining to Jesus, you don't eat with tax collectors and sinners. Jesus was showing hesed. In the Greek, we would call it agape love, unconditional love. You're welcome at my table. Yes, I know you're a sinner, you're a tax collector, but you're still welcome at my table. There's not a lot of grace in the Old Testament, but I think Boaz is a great example in verse 14 of grace. And Jesus showed that same kind of grace for people in his life as well. And we as his followers should do the same to others. we should show that same kind of grace, hesed, loving kindness to other people as well. In fact, as a secondary study, you can learn a lot about how to treat people from Boaz because he was an expert at it. I mean, here was a Moabite woman who was scared out of her mind, who had a very low self-esteem, and he's trying to build her up. And he does an incredible job of doing that. So that scene ends. She has the meal with Boaz and all the servants, his extended family. And now we move on to wrap up scene 2. And there's one final conversation. It's the conversation between Boaz and his workers. And that's in verses 15 through 17. And what we find is that Ruth's going to leave the scene, and Boaz is going to talk with the men. And he's going to tell the men what Ruth is permitted to do and what they are prohibited to do in their relationship with Ruth. And so we have back and forth. This is what Ruth can do, and this is what you're not to do in your relationship with Ruth. And it begins in verse 15, and she got up to glean, meaning Ruth. And I will say one thing about Ruth in this chapter. She's a really hard worker. I mean, she showed up in the morning, she has her meal, and even while others are apparently still eating, she gets up and it's time to go back to work again. So she's a very hard worker, and Boaz gave orders to his men. Now Boaz puts on the boss cap. And he's going to talk to his male servants and give them some very specific instructions regarding Ruth. And he says to them, first of all, let her gather among the sheaves. Now, this whole idea of the sheaves has somewhat stumped scholars as to exactly what are they talking about. Because sheaves was mentioned back in verse 7 when Ruth asked permission to glean. Now, technically, the sheaves would mean that she could glean right next to the women harvesters, and she would get the first of everything. So among the gleaners, she's number 1. And she gets to follow very closely to them, and she gets what's left over, and that would be a lot for her. So by allowing her this, Boaz is going to make sure that Ruth goes home with lots of grain at the end of the day. He's going to give her a special privilege to take home a lot. And so that's basically the meaning there. And then he says, don't reprimand her. And reprimand is one translation. It can also mean to shame, to humiliate, to disgrace. And if Boaz doesn't say this, I'm sure that all of Boaz's servants are not as kind as he is. I'm sure that all of them are not as cultured as he is. And it would have been very easy for them to shame, disgrace, and humiliate Ruth as a Moabite. I mean, who let the Moabite in the field? It's like you can't have that. No, you're only allowed this little over here. You can't take that big stalk there. You have to take the little stalk. And by the time they shame her and humiliate her, at the end of the day, she's just going to want to go home and never come back. So Boaz, the boss, says, we're not treating her like that. And for a foreign woman, unattached, destitute, it could be dangerous for her out in the fields. And Boaz has already told her to hang out with the women servants, so she's always in a group. And now he's telling the men, leave her alone. If she takes something that you don't think she should take, just zip it. Don't say a word. Let her do whatever she wants to do. Don't humiliate her, shame her. Don't do anything to put her down. So he's very specific in what he wants to see happen. And so he's giving her all of these special privileges. So she's a gleaner still, but she's like the number 1 gleaner. And she's going to go home with a lot of food by the end of the day. Well, it continues in verse 16. even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. Now, apparently some of the stalks, that they should have cut, or maybe they cut them and just leave them so she can pick them up. And also, as they're harvesting, they get a lot of grain in their hands and that they can just hold. And basically saying, just drop some of that on the ground so she can come in behind you and pick it up. In other words, let's make this easy on this woman to glean. Leave her a lot on purpose and make it easy on her to glean. Because looking at gleaning could be a really difficult job. I mean, if the harvesters do a really good job, there's not much left. And you would have to work long hours possibly to just feed yourself for one day. But he's saying, let's make this easy on her. Just leave a lot. And then don't rebuke her. And the idea of rebuke is to scold her. So if she does something that you don't think she should be allowed to do, just leave her alone. Don't say anything to her. So we find that Boaz has this incredible plan. He's going to protect her. He's going to provide for her. He's going to give her special privileges, making life as easy for her as he possibly can. He is the one who shows her favor. And as he prayed that God would pay her back for being nice to Naomi, he's going to be the one that God uses to provide for her and pay her back and give her all of these things. Well, it wraps up in verse 17. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. And evening could mean until the sun went down, because you'd have to stop then, because there'd be no light. So she stays there all day. And she works hard all day. And then she's able to thresh the barley, which is to beat it out. She used a stick or a rod. And then she ends up with an ephah of barley. And it's difficult to go from those ancient measurements to modern measurements. The NIV translates this in the notes. She came away with about 30 pounds or 13 kilos of barley. And from others that I read, it's somewhere between 25 to 30 pounds. I mean, which could be a lot to have to carry home with you as well. Hopefully she didn't have to go very far. So basically in that one day, she goes home with enough food to feed herself and Naomi for at least a week, maybe more. So apparently the workers cooperate. They make it easy on her. And Ruth is a hard worker. You have to give her credit for that. She stays there all day. And she goes from at the beginning of the day, she has no food. The end of the day, she's got enough food to feed them for at least a week. So she did find favor. She found a place of acceptance. She found a place where she would be protected and provided for. And that would be a big answer for her and for Naomi as well. Well, in the next verses, we'll look at how Naomi responds when Ruth comes home with all of that grain and the conversation that they have. Well, tonight we've learned that when it comes to treating people, we should show them favor. We can learn a lot from Boaz about how to treat the people in our lives. And so whether it's the people in your church family or the people in your neighborhood or the people in your biological family, we learn a lot about showing favor to people. And so let's be people who show grace and mercy to others and show them the love of Christ as well. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this story. We thank you for this lesson. And Boaz is certainly a great example of what it means to treat people with respect. And here was a man who had great wealth. He had many servants, but he was willing to help someone who was a foreigner, someone who had shown some grace and mercy to Naomi, and he was willing to repay that by showing favor to her. And may we, out of the great salvation that you have given us, show mercy and grace and love to people in our lives too. May we be known as people who are willing to help, willing to serve, willing to be there for others. So, Father, I pray that we'll take this lesson home with us and apply it in all of our relationships with the people that are close to us. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.